It was a tragedy in human terms, a 4.5-year conflict between Israelis and Palestinians that began in September 2000 and claimed about 4,000 lives in all, many of them civilians. Most people call it the Second Intifada, but it goes by other names as well: the Al-Aqsa Intifada, the Oslo War, and Arafat's War, just to name a few. Suicide bombings, targeted killings, gun attacks, the construction of a security fence, and rock throwing produced some of its most iconic images. But how did it begin? Why has it come to symbolize, perhaps more than any war in Israel's history, the violent and volatile nature of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict? To understand the origins of the Second Intifada, we really need to go back to the signing of the first Oslo Accords in September 1993. The Oslo Accords were a set of agreements, initially secretive, and then formalized publicly between the Israeli government and the Palestine Liberation Organization, or PLO. They provided a framework for peace negotiations between the two sides in distinct stages with the goal of achieving a set of permanent agreements. In July 2000, Israeli Prime Minister Ehud Barak and Palestinian Authority leader Yasser Arafat accepted an invitation from US President Bill Clinton to take part in the Camp David summit. The meeting represented a bold attempt to end the Israeli-Palestinian conflict once and for all. According to political science professor Jeremy Pressman, the parties agreed that it was all or nothing. Either there was an agreement on every issue and an end to the conflict, or nothing was agreed to. The 2-week-long summit ended with no agreement, and each side blamed the other for the failure. In the weeks after the Camp David summit, tensions between Israelis and Palestinians were on the rise. Those on the Israeli right felt relieved that no concessions had been made that could increase terror. Among Palestinians, there was a shift towards polarization as factions of the main Palestinian movement, Fatah, shifted their allegiances to terror organizations like Hamas and Islamic Jihad. This was the backdrop for an event that many see as the spark that set off the Second Intifada. On September 28, 2000, a delegation from the Likud party accompanied opposition leader Ariel Sharon on a visit to the Temple Mount, the holiest site in Judaism. The compound also includes two famous Islamic landmarks, the Dome of the Rock and the Al-Aqsa Mosque. Now, because of the sensitive nature of the Temple Mount, the Israeli government has enforced a controversial ban arranged with Muslim leadership on non-Muslims praying there. When Sharon and the Likud delegation visited the site, hundreds of riot police accompanied them. The visit was only approved by the Israeli government after receiving assurances from the Palestinian Authority's security chief that Sharon could enter the compound without incident so long as he didn't go into the mosque. And Israeli intelligence independently came to the same conclusion. Sharon's time visiting the compound was pretty uneventful. He didn't enter a mosque and made no statement while on the Temple Mount. And although there was no immediate reaction from the Palestinians, rioting broke out just as he left. Young men coming out of the Al-Aqsa Mosque threw stones towards Jewish worshippers at the Western Wall, and in the ensuing scuffle, Israeli police fired tear gas and rubber bullets. 25 policemen were injured, one seriously, while 3 Palestinians were hurt by the rubber bullets. One day after Sharon's visit, large riots broke out in the old city of Jerusalem. Palestinians again threw rocks down at Jewish worshippers at the Western Wall, and after the Jerusalem police chief was rendered unconscious by a rock attack, the police switched to using live ammunition. At the end of the day, 7 Palestinians lay dead. 200 civilians, including Israelis, Palestinians, and tourists, were wounded, as were 70 Israeli police officers. Demonstrations soon took place throughout the Palestinian territories. Israeli security forces responded with both rubber bullets and live ammunition. Almost 50 Palestinians were killed and more than 1,800 were injured in the first 5 days. Palestinians blamed Sharon's visit to the Temple Mount, which they saw as an intentional provocation for the outbreak of the violence. But the underlying cause, according to many Palestinians, was actually the continuing Israeli presence in the West Bank even after the Oslo agreements. Despite the Palestinian leadership not keeping up their side of the agreements, Palestinians expected their lives to improve after Oslo, with greater freedoms and control. They not only failed to see these things materialize, but they viewed the situation as having worsened by the end of the decade. Many Palestinians believed that diplomacy had proven fruitless and turned instead to confrontation. What made this conflict different was the prevalence and level of brutality, which far exceeded anything seen during the First Intifada. In the immediate aftermath of Sharon's visit to the Temple Mount, the violence began to escalate. On September 30th, 2000, there was a gunfight between Palestinians and Israeli troops in a Gaza Strip alleyway. Video taken by a Palestinian cameraman working for French TV showed a father and his 12-year-old son huddled together next to a concrete cylinder, the father trying to protect his son from the bullets. The voiceover by the French television station said that the boy, Mohammed al-Dura, had been killed by Israeli fire. Mohammed was viewed as a martyr throughout the Muslim world. Postage stamps from Arab countries showed the heart-wrenching image of father and son trying to stay alive. As time went on, however, both the accuracy of the reporting on this incident and the events themselves began to be questioned. It was revealed that several seconds of footage were cut from the TV broadcast showing the boy apparently still alive. Also, the Palestinians didn't conduct an investigation into the boy's death, and no autopsy was performed. Another tragic event occurred 12 days later. 2 Israeli Defense Force reservists accidentally entered the city of Ramallah. Palestinian police stopped them and took them to a police station. Now, the atmosphere in the city was tense at that time, as thousands had just attended the funeral of a 17-year-old killed in clashes with Israeli troops. An angry mob numbering more than 1,000 assembled in front of the police station, demanding the death of the Israelis. It wasn't long before they stormed the building and murdered the 2 soldiers. It appears the Palestinian policemen inside attempted to prevent the lynching, as most of them suffered injuries during the incident. On the other hand, officials of the Palestinian Authority, whose headquarters were nearby, don't seem to have taken any action until it was already too late. The Israeli soldiers were beaten and stabbed. In one of the most ghoulish episodes of the conflict, a young Palestinian man appeared at the window of the police station to proudly show his hands, soaked in the blood of the Israeli soldiers, to the public, who responded with cheers. The mob brutalized and mutilated their corpses, then dragged them to a central square for celebrations. The violence intensified. In May 2001, 2 Israeli teenage boys were tortured and murdered in a cave while on a hiking trip near their village. In June 2001, 21 Israelis, mostly teenage girls, were murdered by a Hamas suicide bomber at the Dolphinarium, a nightclub in Tel Aviv. In August 2001, a suicide bombing at the Sbarro pizza restaurant in Jerusalem claimed 15 lives. In December 2001, 2 Hamas suicide bombers killed 13 Israeli civilians and wounded 188 on Ben Yehuda Street in Jerusalem. March 2002 was a particularly bloody month with 4 suicide bombings. One was carried out at a Passover Seder in Netanya that killed 30 people. In response to the Netanya attack, Israel undertook a massive military operation known as Defensive Shield. This plan to quell the terror wave involved retaking control over cities Israel had given to the Palestinians in 1995 as part of the Oslo Accords. Under Palestinian Authority control, some of these cities had developed into terror bases, realizing the worst fears of Israelis who had hoped that Palestinian self-rule would lead to less violence, not more. The city of Jenin is a good example. In 2002, Jenin was home to more than a third of the 60 suicide bombers who attacked Israel. Israeli forces took control of the town in a fierce battle. Palestinian claims that a massacre had occurred in Jenin were widely publicized, but subsequent investigations found that the fighting occurred on both sides, with no evidence of things like straight-up executions or massacres. The effect of Operation Defensive Shield was a significant drop in the number of suicide bombings in the latter part of 2002 and in 2003, decreasing by about 50 to 70%. The threat to Israeli civilians wasn't eliminated, but it was definitely greatly diminished. In addition to ordering troops into West Bank towns, the Israeli government under Ariel Sharon decided in June 2002 to move forward with the construction of a security barrier, mostly in the form of a fence, to prevent terrorists from entering Israeli areas. The barrier has proven effective in stopping terrorists, a conclusion supported by statistics and acknowledged by almost everyone, including the Palestinian terror groups themselves. In a 2017 study published in the Journal of Quantitative Criminology, a group of researchers evaluated the effectiveness of the West Bank barrier and concluded that it had prevented suicide bombings and other attacks, and also significantly reduced violence on the Palestinian side of the barrier. For a period of almost 3 years from the beginning of the Second Intifada until the completion of the first continuous segment of the barrier in July 2003, there were 73 suicide bombings that claimed almost 300 Israeli civilian lives. During an equal time period, beginning with the completion of the first segment, only 12 such attacks came from the West Bank, taking 64 lives. In a 2008 interview with a Qatari newspaper, the leader of the group Palestinian Islamic Jihad complained that the separation barrier limits their ability to carry out suicide bombing attacks, but they had not surrendered and are looking at other ways to carry on with the Intifada. The failure of the Camp David summit and the violence of the Second Intifada brought to a halt the Israeli-Palestinian peace process that had begun with the Oslo Accords in the early 1990s. Feeling that peace overtures had only been repaid with terror, Israeli society moved firmly to the right of the political spectrum and in 2003 elected a Likud government for the first time since the 1980s. Many ordinary Israelis now saw the vision of land for peace as dangerously naive. Sometimes, the closer you get to peace, the more others are motivated to use violence to undermine it. And never did Israel feel the effects of that violence more keenly than during the Second Intifada. Thanks for watching. See you guys next week.